White man slapped black boy, didn't know his father is the U.S. Chief Justice. Get the hell out of my way, boy. The words hit like a slap, and before Darius Marshall could even flinch, the man's hand was already crashing against his cheek. It wasn't just a slap, it was an assault. Darius felt the sting, his body frozen in shock as the sound echoed throughout the crowded airplane cabin. He was 12 years old, barely old enough to understand the weight of what just happened, but old enough to feel the burn of humiliation that came with it. His first flight. His first taste of freedom. This trip to New York City, paid for by his father, was supposed to be a celebration. It was supposed to be a time for Darius to have fun, to see his siblings, to live out his summer vacation dream. Instead, he was suddenly thrust into a nightmare. His father, one of the most powerful men in the United States, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, had arranged this trip for him. But right now, none of that mattered. No one on this plane knew who Darius was. No one knew that he was the son of a man whose name commanded respect and fear in every courtroom in the country. In that moment, to the man who slapped him, to the passengers around him, Darius was nothing more than another black boy, one who didn't belong. "Stay out of my way," the man hissed, his eyes filled with a venomous hatred. He turned away, leaving Darius standing there, his cheek red and burning, his heart pounding in his chest. Darius's hands shook as he gripped the armrest, his mind racing. He wanted to scream, to fight back, to tell the man exactly who he was, but no words came. Instead, he stood frozen, his eyes scanning the faces of the passengers around him. Some looked away, pretending not to see, while others simply stared, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Darius couldn't believe it. He had been proud to be going on this trip, excited to see his family. But now, he felt small, invisible, like nothing more than an object to be dismissed and discarded. His father's powerful title meant nothing. In this moment, it was clear. No matter how high his father had climbed, it would never protect him from the reality of what people saw when they looked at him. A black boy. Do you understand what that feels like? To be judged by the color of your skin? To be humiliated not for something you did, but simply for who you are? This boy, this child, just trying to live his life, just trying to have a good time, was thrown into a world that didn't see him as a person, but as a symbol of everything that the world thought was wrong. Do you think that's something we should just let slide? But this story doesn't end here. What happens next? How will Darius handle what's been thrown at him? How will his father, a man who stood in the highest court in the land, react when he finds out about the attack on his son? And more importantly, will anyone take a stand? If you've ever experienced something like this, if you've ever felt the sting of prejudice or humiliation because of your skin color, we want to hear your story. Where did it happen? How did you fight back? Or did you? This is just the beginning of Darius's journey. You need to hear what happens next. Hit that like button, subscribe to the Hyper Racism channel, and share this story. If you believe racism has no place in this world, if you know this is a fight we all need to be part of, stick with us. This is just the start. Let's make sure we all stand up together. Darius Marshall was the kind of boy who made people smile without trying. Bright, curious, and full of life, he had the kind of energy that could light up any room. At just 12 years old, he was already attending Jefferson Preparatory Academy, one of the most respected middle schools in Washington, D.C. He loved science, especially airplanes, and dreamed of one day becoming an aerospace engineer. His teachers often said he had the mind of a leader and the heart of a peacemaker. To his father, Justice Nathaniel Marshall, those words were a source of quiet pride. To his mother, Dr. Angela Marshall, a pediatrician, they were a reminder that their son was destined for great things. Darius was the youngest of 4. His siblings, 2 sisters, Kennedy and Layla, and his older brother, Marcus, were already in New York City for the summer, staying with relatives. They'd been texting him all week, sending photos of the bright lights, the food, the parks. He couldn't wait to join them. His father had arranged everything: his ticket, his seat, even the airline meal. This was his first time flying alone, and he was practically vibrating with excitement. The idea of soaring above the clouds, seeing the skyline of New York for the first time, felt like stepping into a dream. His dad had given him one last hug at the airport before sending him off. "Remember who you are, son," he'd said in his deep, calm voice. "Be polite, be respectful, and stay strong." Darius didn't know how much those words would matter later. The plane was sleek, modern, a Boeing 787 Dreamliner, all polished chrome and smooth leather seats. Passengers were boarding steadily, filling the cabin with the rustle of luggage and the murmur of conversation. Darius found his seat, 12A, right by the window, where he could watch the world shrink as they climbed into the sky. He smiled to himself, pressing his small backpack against his legs, looking around in awe. That's when he appeared. A man in his mid-40s, dressed sharply in a tailored gray suit, approached. He carried himself like someone used to being obeyed, his posture stiff, his expression sharp, his shoes polished to a shine. His name was Richard Caldwell, a corporate lobbyist with powerful political connections and an ego to match. Everyone who knew him knew he was the kind of man who believed the world should bend to his will. The kind who thought respect was owed to him, not earned. He stopped beside Darius, his eyes narrowing as he looked down at the boy sitting comfortably in the premium cabin. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, with a faint smirk that didn't reach his eyes, he snapped, "You're in the wrong seat, kid." Darius blinked, confused. "No, sir. This is 12A. That's what my ticket says." He held up his boarding pass with a shy smile, still polite, still unaware that this moment was about to change everything. Caldwell's smirk twisted into disgust. "What did you say to me?" Before Darius could answer, the man's voice rose, drawing the attention of a few nearby passengers. "How can your kind sit where my kind is supposed to sit? You think you belong here?" His words were cold, deliberate, dripping with venom. "Your kind can never belong here. Not while people like us are still alive." The words hung in the air like poison. Gasps rippled through the rows around them. A woman across the aisle covered her mouth in shock. A flight attendant froze mid-step, unsure whether to step in or not. Darius's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't even realize his hands were shaking until he heard his own voice, trembling but clear. "What did I do? Why would you slap me?" His eyes were wide, confused, desperate for an answer that made sense. But there was none. Richard Caldwell stared down at him, unbothered. "You think money or a fancy name changes who you are? It doesn't. You'll never be one of us." The tension in the cabin snapped like a rubber band. A passenger called out, "Hey, man! He's just a kid." Another shouted, "You can't talk to him like that." But Caldwell stood his ground, sneering, his arrogance filling the space like smoke. The flight attendant finally rushed forward, her voice shaking. "Sir, please calm down. You're causing a disturbance." Caldwell turned on her with the same venom. "Do you know who I am?" The cabin was chaos now, phones out, passengers recording, whispers flying up and down the aisle. Darius sat frozen, his cheeks still red, his eyes wet. The humiliation was unbearable. The fear, unfamiliar. He didn't understand how someone could hate him this much for doing nothing at all. But this was only the beginning. Because what no one in that airplane knew, not the passengers, not the crew, not even Richard Caldwell himself, was who Darius truly was. They didn't know the boy they just humiliated was the son of one of the most powerful men in the United States. They didn't know the call that would soon come through would shake the airline to its core. The plane was still on the tarmac, and every second felt heavier than the last. The cameras were rolling. The world was about to watch what happens when arrogance meets justice. And when hate collides with power, what will happen when the truth comes out? What happens when the name Marshall is finally spoken aloud? Stay with this story, because the moment that call is made, everything will change. The tension in the cabin was palpable. As the moments dragged on, the air around Darius felt thick, suffocating. His cheeks still burned from the slap, his eyes stinging with the unshed tears of a 12-year-old boy who never expected to face something like this. And yet, there he was, alone in a sea of strangers, humiliated, his body still trembling as he tried to hold it together. The man, Richard Caldwell, stood a few feet away, looking down at Darius as if he were some sort of lesser being. His smugness, his cold eyes, they burned through the boy like daggers. The other passengers shifted in their seats, some whispering among themselves, others pretending to be oblivious to the scene unfolding. The flight attendants exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unsure of what to do. Darius, on the other hand, had no idea how to react. What was he supposed to say to this man? What could he say? No one had ever treated him like this before. He had always been taught to respect his elders, to stay calm in the face of adversity. But this wasn't just an argument. This wasn't a disagreement about who sat where. This was hate, pure and simple. And it was directed at him for nothing more than his skin color. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. His body was on autopilot now, trying to calm his nerves, trying to stay composed. His father would want him to stay calm. His father would want him to rise above it. But the injustice of it all was starting to burn too brightly in his chest. He wanted to shout, to yell at the man who had slapped him, to demand an apology. But something in him held back. Something made him sit there, quietly, fists clenched by his sides, while the world watched in stunned silence. Richard Caldwell took another step forward, his eyes narrowing with contempt. "What's the matter, kid? Too scared to speak up?" He sneered, looking down at Darius with an expression of utter disdain. "Maybe you don't belong here. Maybe you should have stayed in your place." The man's words were like a slap to Darius's very soul. He had been raised to believe that no one was better than anyone else. That every person, regardless of where they came from or what they looked like, deserved respect. But here, at this moment, none of that seemed to matter. Darius opened his mouth again, this time forcing the words out. "What did I do? Why would you slap me?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, as if the man's hatred was the only answer needed. But before Darius could speak again, Caldwell interrupted. "Your kind don't get to sit where people like me sit," he spat, his voice filled with venom. "How dare you think you belong on a flight like this? How dare you think you can share space with us?" He waved his hand dismissively, as if Darius's very presence was an affront to his dignity. "People like you don't belong in the same place as people like me." His words were harsh, cutting through the air with a chilling finality. Darius's heart raced. He had heard stories about people who thought like this, about people who thought skin color determined worth. But he never thought it would happen to him. Not to him, not when his father fought so hard for justice. Not when his mother worked tirelessly every day to make a difference. How could this man, with all his money and power, be so blind? So filled with hatred? The flight attendants, still standing frozen by the galley, exchanged nervous glances. The other passengers, some still watching, others pretending not to notice, seemed unsure how to react. The moment was heavy, filled with a silence that echoed louder than the slap ever could. Darius's fingers curled into fists in his lap. He could feel the weight of the situation press down on him, but he refused to let it break him. He didn't want to give this man the satisfaction of seeing him crumble. He wouldn't. Not when so many people had fought so hard to make him believe that he was more than what others thought of him. But then, just as the tension reached its peak, something inside Darius shifted. His father's words came rushing back to him, words he had heard 1,000 times before. "Don't let anyone tell you who you are. You define that." And suddenly, something inside Darius snapped. He wasn't just some kid. He wasn't just another boy to be put down. He was Darius Marshall, son of Justice Nathaniel Marshall, a man who had devoted his entire life to fighting for fairness and equality. His father's name, his legacy, was more than just a title. It was a symbol of everything right in this world, a world that didn't judge people based on their skin, but by their actions. Darius looked up at Richard Caldwell, his eyes no longer trembling with fear but filled with quiet determination. He took a deep breath, then spoke, his voice calm, but powerful. "You have no idea who I am, do you?" The words landed like a bomb in the stillness of the cabin. The man blinked, his smirk faltering for just a second. "What do you mean?" Caldwell asked, his voice suddenly less sure, more guarded. Darius stood up, straightening his shoulders. "I said, you have no idea who I am." His voice was steady now, no longer quivering with fear or uncertainty. "My father, he's Justice Nathaniel Marshall, one of the highest judges in the United States. And right now, I'm on this flight because he thought I deserved a vacation. But if you think that makes a difference to people like you, well, you're wrong. The words hit the air with a crackle of electricity. For a moment, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Caldwell's response. But Caldwell's face, which had been so full of confidence, now twisted into something else. It was a look of confusion, followed by disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The entire plane had become silent, as if the announcement of Darius's father's identity had shifted the power dynamic in the blink of an eye. And then, just when it seemed like the confrontation would reach its boiling point, the cabin door opened, and a voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been informed of an incident in the cabin. Please remain calm. We are handling it." But was the situation truly handled? Would the truth of Darius's father change the course of what was happening in this cabin? Or would the man who had slapped him continue with his hateful ways? What would happen next? Would justice come swiftly, or would this story take an unexpected turn? The silence in the cabin felt almost suffocating. The words Darius had just spoken hung in the air, thick with tension. His chest rose and fell with each steady breath, his eyes locked on Richard Caldwell, whose face had gone from smug arrogance to complete shock in a matter of seconds. It was as though the weight of Darius's revelation had hit him like a freight train, but the sting of humiliation hadn't quite settled in. For a moment, Caldwell stood there, speechless. The calm composure he had worn like armor throughout the entire flight cracked, revealing an underlying sense of fear, uncertainty, a rare and uncomfortable emotion for a man like him. His grip on his briefcase tightened, knuckles turning white. His mouth opened, then closed as if he couldn't find the right words. The passengers in the cabin exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to react. Some still stared at Darius in disbelief, while others seemed to pity Caldwell. The news of Darius's father, a Supreme Court justice, had hit harder than a slap. It was as though the power in the room had shifted, the weight of Darius's name changing everything in an instant. Caldwell's confident smirk, the one that had been so sure of itself just moments before, faltered. His eyes darted around the cabin, searching for any escape, any way to dismiss what had just happened. But there was nowhere to hide now. The truth was out, and the consequences were just beginning to unfold. "You are what?" Caldwell stammered, his voice shaking ever so slightly. It was the first crack in his previously impenetrable armor. "I said," Darius repeated, his voice steady but with an edge that could cut glass. "My father is Justice Nathaniel Marshall. He's one of the highest judges in the country. And right now, you're sitting in a seat that doesn't belong to you." Darius's words were a quiet force, each one carrying the weight of the legacy that had just been revealed. The cabin, once filled with whispers and shifting eyes, had gone deathly quiet. Passengers turned their heads, their eyes wide, as they watched the confrontation unfold. This wasn't just any child standing up for himself. This was a direct challenge to the very foundation of power that Caldwell had rested his life on. Caldwell, however, wasn't about to admit defeat just yet. The shock in his face quickly faded, replaced by a cold sneer, though it was no longer quite as confident as before. He straightened his posture, puffed out his chest, and let out a deep breath, as though to reclaim some semblance of control. His eyes hardened, and the corner of his mouth twitched upwards into a twisted grin. The panic that had flooded him moments before was slowly being replaced by defiance, a dangerous arrogance that made the hair on the back of Darius's neck stand up. "So what?" Caldwell spat, his voice rising in volume, growing louder with every word. "Your father is a justice. Does that mean you think you're better than me?" He laughed harshly, the sound grating against the tense air. "I don't care who your father is. You're just a kid. You think that matters here? You think you can intimidate me with your name?" His words were venomous, but there was a crack in his voice, something Darius hadn't expected. It was as if the man was trying to convince himself that he still had power, that the truth didn't matter. But it did. And Darius knew it. The whole cabin knew it. "You're nothing but a little boy," Caldwell continued, his voice rising with each word, now directed not just at Darius but at the entire cabin. You think just because your father's a big shot, you can make me look bad? You think you can embarrass me? His eyes flicked toward the flight attendants, his hand motioning toward them as if to dismiss them. You should be grateful you're not kicked off this plane right now. The arrogance in his voice only made it worse. It wasn't just a defense mechanism, it was an attempt to reclaim control. Caldwell was used to commanding respect, used to being the one who decided who belonged and who didn't. But here, now, in this moment, he was losing everything. Darius stood his ground, refusing to back down. He'd come this far, and he wasn't going to let this man intimidate him any longer. It's not about who I am, Mr. Caldwell. It's about who you are. And what you just did to me was wrong. You don't get to treat people like that, especially not when you're surrounded by strangers who will hold you accountable. The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. And just like that, the power shifted once again. The passengers, many of whom had been silent witnesses to the confrontation, were now on edge, whispering amongst themselves. A few more had taken out their phones, recording the scene, while others shot Caldwell disapproving glances. Caldwell was losing his grip. His proud, aggressive stance began to falter, his eyes flickering with something unfamiliar, fear. He could feel the eyes of the passengers on him, the weight of the entire situation crashing down on him. But rather than back down, he chose to lash out again. You don't know who I am, boy, he snarled, his face turning red with anger. I've got connections, people who don't care about the color of my skin or yours. I've been to the top, and people like me stay at the top. You think your daddy's power means something here? You don't even know the half of it. His words were a final, desperate attempt to cling to whatever semblance of authority he had left. But in that moment he was only digging himself deeper. It was as if the very act of trying to assert dominance was making him look weaker. The truth about Darius had shattered his bravado, and the reality of the situation was setting in. Darius's heart raced, but his resolve remained firm. No, Mr. Caldwell. What you don't understand is that your power doesn't mean a damn thing if you don't use it for good. You're just a bully, hiding behind your connections. But it's over now. Just as Darius spoke, the captain's voice boomed over the intercom, interrupting the tension that had reached its peak. Ladies and gentlemen, we are making an emergency landing due to a disruption in the cabin. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. This will take no more than a few minutes. The words struck like a sudden jolt of electricity. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, but Darius's focus never wavered from Richard Caldwell. His words had struck a nerve, and the man knew it. But it wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. What would happen when they landed? Would Caldwell be held accountable for his actions, or would he somehow escape yet again? Was Darius's victory just the beginning of a much larger battle? Stay tuned. The next twist is about to shake everything to its core. The cabin remained tense, but now, a new, more urgent atmosphere had taken hold. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom, cutting through the thick silence that had settled like a heavy fog over the plane. Attention, ladies and gentlemen. The captain's voice was calm, but there was an underlying sense of authority. We are initiating an emergency landing. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. Further instructions will be given once we are on the ground. Thank you for your cooperation. Darius's heart skipped a beat. Emergency landing? It felt like the universe was conspiring to keep this nightmare going. Just when he thought things might settle down, they had only escalated. His gaze flicked toward Richard Caldwell, who had grown increasingly agitated. His face was flushed, his hand clutching his briefcase so tightly his knuckles were white. The phone that had once served as his connection to power now seemed like a useless accessory. Darius could see it in his eyes. Caldwell was losing control. And as much as he wanted to stand there and let the man squirm, he knew the situation was far from over. The passengers, who had been nervously shifting in their seats, were now whispering among themselves, their voices rising in confusion and fear. The reality of the emergency landing was sinking in. This was no longer just an altercation between a young boy and a racist man. It was something bigger. The threat of an emergency landing meant that things were spiraling out of control in ways no one could have predicted when the flight first took off. Darius tried to keep his mind focused, reminding himself that he had done nothing wrong. He had been calm, composed, and resilient. Yet, the idea of landing with the weight of everything that had happened seemed almost too much to bear. The cabin lights flickered briefly, casting eerie shadows over the faces of the passengers. Darius noticed that the flight attendants, once so composed, were now moving swiftly up and down the aisles, taking their seats in preparation for the landing. They exchanged nervous glances, clearly aware of the tension in the air. Caldwell, still standing near the front of the cabin, could no longer keep up the bravado. His body language had shifted. Gone was the self-assured man who had slapped Darius without a second thought. Now, he was the one who looked cornered, desperate for control. He turned to the flight attendants, his voice shaking slightly as he addressed them. "Look, I don't know what's going on, but you need to fix this," he demanded, the arrogance still in his tone but less certain now. "I'm a VIP. Do you understand me? This whole thing is a misunderstanding. I demand to be treated with respect." The attendants barely acknowledged him as they strapped themselves in. They had been through too many emergency procedures to be fazed by Caldwell's tantrum. It was clear that the situation was much bigger than his demands. The flight had descended into chaos, and the landing was inevitable. Darius's fingers gripped the armrest in front of him as he looked out the window. The once serene view of the clouds below had turned dark and ominous. The plane began its descent, and the pressure in Darius's chest tightened. This wasn't just a flight, it was a flashpoint, a turning point in a story that was far from finished. As the plane began its final descent, a moment of profound silence fell over the cabin. The noise of the engines seemed to fade as everyone held their breath, knowing that the resolution of the incident was close. They were moments away from landing, and the uncertainty of what would happen next hung over them like a dark cloud. Caldwell continued to mutter under his breath, pacing up and down the aisle, but no one was listening to him anymore. The power he once thought he held was slipping away. His earlier threats felt hollow now, as if the very air had deflated him. He had been ready to wield his connections, to call in favors, but now he was just a man on a plane, facing the consequences of his actions. The flight attendants were focused on their duties, preparing for the emergency landing. The passengers sat nervously, some looking out the windows, others checking their phones. The tension was thick, and Darius could feel his heart racing, unsure of what to expect when the plane touched down. As the wheels of the plane finally made contact with the runway, the jolt sent a ripple of movement through the cabin. The emergency lights flickered on, casting an eerie glow over the faces of the passengers. There was no turning back now. The plane taxied off the runway and came to a slow, grinding halt on the tarmac. The flight attendants immediately sprang into action, unbuckling their seatbelts and moving toward the exits. Darius could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles outside, their red and blue lights reflecting off the windows. The scene was surreal. It wasn't just an emergency landing, it was the culmination of everything that had gone wrong on this flight. The slap, the threats, the power struggles. Caldwell stood frozen, his face pale, as the reality of the situation began to sink in. He had tried to wield his power, tried to intimidate a young boy who had done nothing wrong. But now, the tables had turned. The world was no longer listening to him. The power he thought he had was gone, reduced to nothing more than a man desperate to regain control. But just as Darius thought the chaos would finally end, a figure appeared at the front of the cabin. The flight crew had been preparing for an evacuation, but it was clear that something more was coming. The figure was tall, wearing a suit that was as sharp as his demeanor. He walked towards Caldwell, his eyes scanning the room, and without a word, he extended his hand toward the man. "We need to speak," the figure said, his voice calm but firm. Caldwell's face was drained of color. He knew who this was, the one person who could make all of his problems disappear, or expose him. Was this the end for Caldwell? Or would his connections be enough to once again shield him from the consequences of his actions? The atmosphere in the cabin was suffocating. The flashing emergency lights outside the plane reflected in the windows, casting an eerie glow inside. Darius remained seated, his hands still gripping the armrest, though his knuckles had turned white. His mind raced, but his body remained calm, something his father had always drilled into him. But inside, beneath the calm exterior, Darius's emotions were a whirlpool of anger, confusion, and most of all, a sense of empowerment that he had never felt before. Caldwell, now standing near the front of the cabin, was trying to regain some semblance of control. His phone was pressed against his ear, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for someone to help him. The smug arrogance that had defined him earlier was gone, replaced by a frantic desperation. He was calling people, high-ranking officials, influential figures in the judicial system, anyone who could help him extricate himself from the mess he had made. But with every call, Caldwell's face grew darker. Darius could see it in his eyes, the dawning realization that no one was picking up the phone. The voices on the other end of the line were all the same, distant, uninterested, or flat-out dismissive. No one was going to help him. Not this time. Darius's father, Justice Nathaniel Marshall, had already made the call to the airline authorities. As one of the most powerful men in the United States, the Supreme Court Justice's influence was undeniable. The moment the authorities received the information, they took immediate action. Darius had expected the situation to spiral out of control, but his father's involvement was the game changer. Caldwell's connections and authority, once a shield, were now nothing more than a paper fortress. The power dynamics had shifted once more, and the chaos of the situation now lay in Caldwell's lap. As Darius sat there, the calmness in his chest felt almost surreal. He had expected to feel fear, to feel overwhelmed by everything that was happening around him. But instead, all he felt was clarity. He knew what needed to happen. This man had humiliated him, had tried to tear him down because of something he had no control over. Caldwell had abused his position, and now he was going to face the consequences. "I'm telling you," Caldwell shouted into the phone, his voice trembling with anger, "this is a mistake. I will make sure you regret this. Do you know who I am? Do you know the people I have backing me?" But the voices on the other end of the phone line were silent. The power that had once protected him now abandoned him. No one was coming to his aid. The officers who had boarded the plane stood firm by the exit, their eyes now focused on Caldwell, watching him intently. The silence in the cabin had grown thick with anticipation. The passengers had all witnessed the exchange, the ugly side of the confrontation, and now they were waiting for something to happen. The world felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when justice would be served. Caldwell, still pacing in the aisle, let out a deep, frustrated breath as he hung up the phone for the final time. He turned toward Darius, his face a mask of fury. "You think your father can protect you?" he spat, his voice low but venomous. "You think a judge's power means anything? You think I'll just let you walk away from this?" Darius looked at him, his expression unwavering. "You have no idea what power is," he said, his voice calm but full of strength. "You think you can intimidate people like me with your connections and your money, but it's not going to work. Not anymore." For the first time in the entire ordeal, Caldwell flinched. The words hit harder than any slap. Darius could see it in his eyes. He was no longer the dominant force in this situation. He was the one facing consequences now. His power, his connections, none of it mattered. As the officers moved toward him, one of them stepped forward and addressed him directly, his voice commanding, "Mr. Caldwell, you are under arrest for disturbing the peace and committing a racially charged assault on a minor. We will be taking you off this flight and into custody." Caldwell opened his mouth to protest, but the words died on his tongue as the officers calmly and efficiently restrained him, guiding him toward the rear of the plane. His entire body shook with rage, his eyes darting around the cabin, as though expecting someone, anyone, to come to his aid. But no one did. The passengers, who had witnessed the entire exchange, were now exchanging looks of disbelief. Some were shaking their heads, and others were staring at Caldwell with disdain. Darius had won. He had stood his ground, remained calm in the face of hatred, and in doing so, had exposed the hypocrisy of the man who had tried to break him. The flight attendants began moving down the aisle, ensuring that everyone was secure as they prepared for the next phase of the emergency landing. But Darius wasn't paying attention to them anymore. His eyes were fixed on Caldwell, who was now being escorted off the plane. The man had lost everything. his pride, his power, and now his freedom. Darius sat back in his seat, his body finally relaxing as the weight of the situation began to lift. He had done it. His father's influence, his calmness, his unwavering sense of right and wrong, had all led to this moment. The airplane began its final descent as the officers escorted Caldwell off the plane, their presence signaling the end of a battle that had never truly been his to win. But as Darius looked out the window at the vast sky, something gnawed at him. This was far from over. What would happen to Caldwell now? Would the law truly hold him accountable for his actions, or would his connections get him out of this mess? Darius's journey had just begun, and the consequences of today's actions would reverberate long after they landed. The showdown had been won, but the war against injustice was far from over. Stay with us to find out what happens next. The story is just getting started. As the plane touched down with a jolt, the air in the cabin still crackled with tension. The moment the wheels hit the tarmac, the entire cabin exhaled in unison, the collective breath of passengers who had been holding their breath for what felt like hours. But for Darius, the real work had only just begun. The scene with Richard Caldwell wasn't just an isolated incident on a flight, it was a public spectacle that would forever alter the trajectory of both their lives. As the plane taxied toward the terminal, the last of the airline security officers was leading Caldwell off the aircraft. His steps were heavy, reluctant, as though the gravity of what had just happened was beginning to sink in. The man who had once wielded so much power in the world now looked like a shadow of himself, completely stripped of his arrogance. His expensive suit hung loosely on his frame, and the normally sharp, confident gaze had been replaced by one of desperation. His phone had been taken from him, his one last tether to his wealth and influence, and he now faced the consequences of his own actions. Darius watched from his seat, his expression unwavering. There was no smile of victory on his lips. His heart still pounded in his chest, but it was not fear or anger he felt. It was something far more complex, a mix of relief, satisfaction, and an overwhelming sense of justice. This moment, the confrontation, the humiliation of Caldwell, it wasn't just about standing up for himself. It was about standing up for everyone who had ever been silenced, who had ever been treated unjustly. And in that moment, he knew he had made a difference. As the flight attendants moved to finalize the disembarkation process, the passengers began to gather their things, their whispers filling the air as they moved toward the exits. But the chatter was different now. There was no longer the murmuring of uncomfortable curiosity. Now, people were speaking in hushed tones of admiration. Some exchanged knowing looks with Darius as if to say, "You did it." They had witnessed the transformation of a moment, from humiliation to triumph. Darius was still processing everything. As he moved to stand up, he felt his phone vibrate in his pocket. He pulled it out, his father's name flashing on the screen. A glance toward the cabin door revealed that Caldwell had already been escorted away by the authorities. Darius's heart rate picked up as he answered. "Darius," his father's voice came through clearly, calm and steady. "I just got off the phone with the airline authorities. The situation's being handled." Darius couldn't help but smile, a surge of relief washing over him. "Dad, you're going to make sure something's done about this, right?" Justice Nathaniel Marshall's voice remained as composed as ever, but there was a hint of pride in his tone. "It's already being taken care of. I made sure they understood the gravity of the situation. You handled yourself well, son. Very well. I'm proud of you." Darius couldn't hold back his sigh of relief. The weight he'd carried since the slap, since the moment Caldwell had humiliated him, started to lift. "Thank you, Dad." As the call ended, the sound of footsteps from the aisle reminded Darius that the real world was waiting. He had been through something profound, something that had shaken him to his core, but now it was time to face what came next. The authorities had ensured that Caldwell would be escorted to a holding room at the airport for further questioning, but his fate had already been sealed. His connections, the very ones that he'd relied on for years, had failed him when it mattered most. The airline had acted swiftly, contacting the appropriate channels, and now the real consequences were beginning to unfold. Back in Washington, D.C., the legal process was already underway. As promised, Justice Marshall had called in favors. He wasn't the type to wield his power recklessly, but he had always believed in justice, and this was no exception. Caldwell had made a fatal mistake, and the law was about to catch up with him. A few days later, the court hearing took place, and the world watched as the case unfolded. It was clear that Caldwell had underestimated the ripple effects of his actions. What he thought would be a private matter, one he could bury beneath his wealth and connections, quickly became a national story. The media took hold of it, broadcasting every detail, every word. Darius was no longer just a victim. He had become a symbol of resilience, of standing up against the system that so often silenced the voiceless. The courtroom was packed when the verdict came. Caldwell, facing charges of racial incitement and assault on a minor, sat nervously beside his lawyer. The tension was unbearable. The gavel came down with a resounding crack, and the judge, a close friend of Justice Marshall, as Darius would soon discover, delivered the verdict. Richard Caldwell, you are hereby sentenced to 6 months in prison for the racial incitement and assault of a minor. Additionally, you will face civil penalties and a permanent ban from boarding any flights with this airline for the duration of your sentence. The room erupted in shock. Darius's heart swelled with an emotion he couldn't quite name: vindication. Justice had been served. The man who thought his money, his connections, and his power could protect him had been stripped of everything. His career, his reputation, and his freedom, all taken from him in the blink of an eye. And Darius, the young boy who had endured that slap, had played a part in making sure he faced the consequences. As the press conference following the verdict unfolded, Darius stood beside his father, proud but humbled. His father, who had once stood in the highest courts in the land, now stood beside him as an equal, two people, father and son, who had both fought for justice in different ways. But even as the weight of the verdict settled in, something nagged at Darius's mind. This was over. Caldwell had faced justice. But how many others were out there? How many people in power were still using their influence to oppress and silence those who didn't have the same privilege? The truth was, this wasn't the end. Not for Darius. Not for anyone who had ever been made to feel small because of the color of their skin. As the story of Richard Caldwell's downfall began to make its way through the news, one question loomed large. What would happen next? Would this be a turning point in the fight against racial injustice? Or was this just one man facing consequences, while the system that allowed his actions to flourish remained unchanged? Darius wasn't sure yet, but he was ready to find out. The days following the trial were a blur for Darius. The media coverage, the public interest, the calls from friends and family, everything felt overwhelming. He had gone from an excited 12-year-old, eager for a summer of fun with his siblings, to a symbol of justice in a fight much bigger than he ever imagined. But as the dust began to settle, as the public spectacle faded from the headlines, Darius found himself alone in his room, staring out of his window, deep in thought. His father had been his rock throughout the ordeal, guiding him, teaching him the importance of standing up for what was right. But Darius couldn't shake the questions that lingered in his mind. He had one. Caldwell was being held accountable for his actions. But he couldn't help but wonder, what if his father wasn't a man of such power and influence? What if the man who slapped him wasn't just a corporate lobbyist, but someone with even more connections, more sway? What if Caldwell had been untouchable? What if his father's name had meant nothing, and they had no one to turn to? He thought about the passengers who had watched in silence, the ones who had never spoken up. How many of them had remained quiet because they didn't think they had the power to do anything? How many people across the country faced moments like the one he had, where they were belittled, humiliated, and assaulted simply because of the color of their skin, with no one to turn to for justice? Darius felt a knot tighten in his chest. He realized that it wasn't just about his own experience, it was about the system that allowed people like Caldwell to act with impunity. It was about the fact that, without the influence of his father, without the connections that came with his father's name, he might have never seen justice at all. He could have easily been another victim, just another case of racial discrimination swept under the rug, forgotten by those with the power to make a difference. He closed his eyes and let the thoughts wash over him. He had won this battle. But the war? The war against racial prejudice, against the systems that allowed such discrimination to thrive? that was far from over. What if it wasn't just me? Darius whispered to himself, thinking about the countless other children, families, and individuals who didn't have the same kind of protection he had. What if they didn't have someone like his father? What if they didn't have the support, the connections, or the power to stand up? It was a sobering realization, one that hit him harder than the slap he had received on that plane. He had been lucky. His father's influence had shielded him, had ensured that the system worked for him when it so often failed others. But the truth was, power and influence were often what decided who got justice and who didn't. And what about the people who had none of that? What about the children, the families, the countless voices silenced by the weight of prejudice? Darius knew that the only way to change the system was to make sure that no one had to rely on connections to get justice. Everyone, no matter their race or background, should have access to it. He thought about the lesson his father had always taught him. True justice doesn't just happen in the courts. It happens when we stand up and fight for what's right, no matter who we are. But standing up wasn't always easy. It required strength, yes, but it also required something deeper, courage to face the powers that be, to challenge the systems that perpetuated inequality. Darius realized that, in a way, this was just the beginning. What happened on that plane, the slap, the humiliation, it wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a larger problem, one that existed not just on flights, but in schools, in workplaces, in every corner of society. Racism, prejudice, and discrimination were still alive and well. And if he truly wanted to make a difference, he couldn't stop here. He had to keep fighting. He had to keep speaking out. And he had to make sure that every person, no matter their race, could feel the same sense of justice that he had felt when Caldwell was held accountable. Darius knew now that the real power wasn't in the name of his father's title. The real power was in the ability to fight for what's right, even when it felt impossible. It was in the courage to speak up when others were silent, to stand firm when others turned away. What if my dad wasn't who he is? Darius thought again, the weight of the question lingering in his mind. The thought of what could have happened, what might have happened, shook him to his core. But then the clarity hit him. It wasn't just about what his father could do. It was about what he could do, and what everyone had the power to do if they stood together. This was his fight to, and it wasn't just about one man facing consequences. It was about a larger movement, a reckoning that needed to happen in every corner of society. It was about ensuring that no one ever felt invisible again, no one ever felt like they didn't belong. Darius stood up from his seat by the window, his heart heavy but resolute. He knew now that his journey was just beginning. The fight against injustice would be long, and it would be hard. But as long as he kept pushing, kept speaking out, and kept fighting for what was right, he knew that change was possible. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He was a voice, and his voice would be heard. As Darius walked to the door, ready to face whatever came next, he paused and turned back for one last look at the sky, the same sky that had been there when the storm had started. And now, it was time to let the storm of change begin. The aftermath of the confrontation was swift, and the consequences for Richard Caldwell were both swift and severe. What had begun as an outburst on an airplane turned into a personal and professional nightmare that would follow him for the rest of his life. In the days following the emergency landing, Caldwell's life began to unravel in ways he hadn't even begun to anticipate. The media, once fascinated by his power and status, now turned on him with the ferocity of a predator. Headlines screamed about the incident on the plane, describing in graphic detail the racial slurs, the assault, and the shocking revelation that the boy he had humiliated was the son of a Supreme Court justice. Caldwell's face was splashed across every news outlet, but not in the way he had imagined. Now, his name was synonymous with disgrace. The stories of his previous deeds, his connections to high society, his corporate dealings, all of it was scrutinized and exposed for the public to see. He had once stood atop his world of influence, his name carried weight in the circles of power, but now he was nothing more than a symbol of hatred and entitlement. The businesses he'd once represented quickly distanced themselves from him. His colleagues, the ones who had once listened to his every word, now turned their backs on him. Caldwell was not just ostracized in the media, he was socially exiled. But the most severe consequence came when the legal system turned its attention to him. The racial incitement and assault charges that had followed him from the plane were not taken lightly. The court proceedings, fast-tracked due to the public outcry and the involvement of high authorities, ended with a harsh sentence. Caldwell was sentenced to 6 months in prison for the assault and racial discrimination he had inflicted on Darius. It was a sentence that felt right, yet it barely seemed like enough for the damage he had caused. While serving his sentence, Caldwell's days in prison were anything but easy. Once the powerful corporate lobbyist who could command rooms, he now found himself at the mercy of the same system he had long manipulated. His influence was meaningless behind bars. He spent the first few months stewing in isolation, with nothing but his own thoughts to keep him company. It was there, in the cold, lonely confines of his cell, that he came to a harrowing realization. The world he had known, the world where power and connections determined everything, was gone. What he had once believed was his entitlement was nothing more than an illusion. When Caldwell was finally released, 6 months later, he was a shadow of the man he had been. The weight of the sentence, the public shaming, the loss of his position and influence, it had all taken its toll. His once pristine suit now seemed like a faded relic of a life that no longer existed. The news of his release made headlines once again, but this time, the story was filled with scorn, sympathy, and curiosity. Where once he had stood at the top, commanding respect and admiration, he was now just another example of a powerful man brought down by his own arrogance. Caldwell's reputation was ruined, and the world watched as he tried to rebuild, but the damage was irreparable. The public had already moved on, and there was no room for a man like him in the new landscape. Meanwhile, Darius's life had taken a different turn. His summer vacation, once tainted by the violence of that fateful flight, had transformed into something far more meaningful. Darius had reconnected with his siblings in New York. What had once seemed like a trip filled with excitement and freedom was now a reminder of something greater, the power of standing up for what was right. The vacation wasn't about escaping the pain anymore. It was about reclaiming his sense of self, his sense of justice. He wasn't just a victim of an isolated incident. He was part of a larger fight, one that was far from over. As Darius spent time with his siblings, his mind constantly returned to the lessons he had learned during the entire ordeal. He thought about how different things could have been if he hadn't stood up for himself. If he had let Richard Caldwell's words define him, what would he have become? Would he have just accepted the injustice? Or would he have carried the weight of that moment for the rest of his life, unable to break free of the chains that had been thrust upon him? His father had been the catalyst, but Darius realized that it was his own strength, his own resilience, that had led to the outcome. He wasn't just his father's son, he was someone who would fight for justice, someone who would never let fear silence his voice. That was the true lesson, the one that mattered the most. It was about using the power of his voice, not just to protect himself, but to make sure that no one else was ever subjected to the same kind of hatred and prejudice he had faced. The lessons of the past few weeks were still fresh in his mind as he and his siblings explored the streets of New York. There was laughter now, joy in the simple moments, as they walked through Central Park, ate pizza by the slice, and shared memories of their childhood. The sting of that slap, the anger, the fear, had faded. What remained was a new understanding of the world, a world that needed change, but also one that was full of hope. But even as Darius smiled, as he relished in the happiness of being with his family, there was still a nagging thought in the back of his mind. Caldwell was gone for now, but what about the countless others who still lived with the same hatred, the same prejudice? What about the people who had stood by and said nothing, the ones who had watched the injustice unfold and remained silent? The world had changed for Darius, and in some ways, for those who had witnessed the confrontation. But the question remained, how many people would still stand by and let injustice happen? How many would speak out? And as for Caldwell, his return to society would never be the same. He had been exposed not just as a man capable of prejudice, but as one who thought he could escape the consequences of his actions with his power. But now, with his career in tatters, his reputation ruined, and his name synonymous with disgrace, he had to face the reality that justice had been served. But Darius knew that the fight wasn't over. As long as there were people who still thought they could get away with hatred, the battle would continue. How many more would have to suffer before the world truly changed? This was just the beginning. The story of Darius Marshall, the young boy who had stood up for justice, was far from over. The journey Darius Marshall had taken over the course of this tumultuous summer was nothing short of transformative. What had started as a simple vacation to visit his siblings had spiraled into a moment that tested his character, his resilience, and his sense of justice. What was meant to be a carefree flight had become the catalyst for something far larger. A personal confrontation with racial discrimination that had shaken Darius to his core. In those moments on the plane, when Caldwell had slapped him, humiliated him, and spewed hatred, Darius could have easily crumbled under the weight of the injustice. He could have become just another victim, quietly carrying the scars of that encounter throughout his life. But instead, he did the unthinkable. He stood tall. He spoke up not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, invisible, and inferior. He spoke out for justice, and in doing so, he helped expose the ugly truth that no amount of power or privilege could shield someone from the consequences of their actions. The aftermath of the incident showed just how much could be accomplished when one person refused to stay silent. Caldwell faced the consequences of his actions. His name was dragged through the mud, his career dismantled, and his reputation irrevocably damaged. But the story didn't just end with Caldwell's downfall. The real victory was in the shift that Darius's actions triggered. A shift in how those who witnessed the event saw their own power to stand up against injustice. Darius had won, but he knew the fight was far from over. One battle, one incident of accountability, would never be enough to eradicate the deeply ingrained prejudices that still poison society. The real change would come when more people, like Darius, found the courage to speak out and demand equality. It wasn't enough to serve justice for one man. It wasn't enough to punish one person for their wrongdoing. The change had to be systemic, cultural. A movement that would only grow stronger as more individuals decided that enough was enough. But what about you? What would you have done in Darius's shoes? Would you have stood up for yourself, or would you have stayed silent, hoping the world would fix it on its own? Do you think racial discrimination and prejudice can end? What do you think can be done to curb it? Do you think serving justice is enough to end it? We want to hear your thoughts. Tell us your opinion in the comments. If you believe in fairness, in equality, and in standing up for what's right, then share this video and subscribe to the Hyper-Racism channel. Together, we can be the change we wish to see. If you want to be like Darius, educating and raising awareness, spreading the message that we are all equal, then let's make our voices heard. Thank you for watching. And remember, this fight is just getting started. The power is in our hands to make this world a better place for everyone.